General Marcus Brennan slammed his hand on the briefing table and pointed directly at her face. "Get out of my room!" His voice cut through the air like a blade. Every operator in the room went still. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. And yet she didn't move either. That was the moment everything changed. Before we go any further, if this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button right now and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Now stay with me, because what happened next in that room in Afghanistan is something none of those men would ever forget for the rest of their lives. The briefing room at Forward Operating Base Sentinel was not a place where people got second chances. It was not a place where you walked in late. It was not a place where you showed up without being known. It was not a place where soft mistakes were forgiven quietly and forgotten by morning. Every man in that room had earned a seat through years of blood silence and sacrifice. Every patch on every shoulder meant something. Every scar told a story that outsiders would never be allowed to hear. The air inside that room carried the specific weight of men who had spent their entire careers becoming exactly who they were and who had zero patience for anyone who hadn't paid the same price. General Marcus Brennan stood at the front of that room the way he had stood in 100 rooms before it. Straight spine, hard jaw, eyes that had long ago stopped seeing anything as complicated because he had simplified the world down to two categories: capable and not capable, useful and not useful, his and not his. He was 61 years old. He had 3 decades of classified operations behind him. He had buried men he loved and decorated men he didn't, and he had learned that sentiment was a luxury the mission could not afford. He was not cruel. He would have told you that himself clearly and without apology. He was precise. He was structured. And in his world, structure was the only thing standing between his people and a body bag. That morning, he was walking his team through the final framework of a strike operation that had been 18 months in the planning. The compound, the entry points, the timing windows, the fallback routes. He had memorized every detail the way a surgeon memorizes an incision, not because he had to, but because that level of ownership was the only kind of leadership he understood. Chief Petty Officer Rodriguez sat at the far left of the room, arms crossed, watching the projection with the calm focus of a man who had done this kind of work so many times it had become something close to routine. Though he would never say that out loud, because in this business, calling something routine was how you ended up dead. Rodriguez was 38 years old. He had 14 confirmed kills, 2 silver stars, and a reputation among the team for being the one who asked the questions nobody else wanted to ask. Beside him sat Petty Officer First Class Torres, lean and quiet, a man of very few words, who communicated almost entirely through facial expressions, and whose current expression was one of focused attention, edged with the low hum of professional anticipation. Next to Torres was Lieutenant Damian Holt, the youngest full operator in the room at 29, sharp enough to be dangerous, but still young enough to believe that capability was always immediately visible to anyone worth impressing. They were deep into the briefing. Brennan was pointing to a satellite overlay of the northern perimeter when the door opened. No knock. That alone was enough to make Rodriguez's head turn. The door opened and a soldier stepped in. She was not large. She was not decorated in any obvious way. She carried no rank insignia that anyone in the room recognized at a glance. She was dressed in standard issue field clothing, her dark hair pulled back in a way that was entirely functional and contained nothing meant to be noticed. She was carrying a duffel bag over one shoulder and a long, hard-sided case in her right hand. She stepped into the room the way someone steps through a door they have already decided belongs to them, not with arrogance, but with a kind of settled certainty that was somehow more unsettling than arrogance would have been. Brennan stopped speaking mid-sentence. The room went quiet. She walked to the far right side of the room, set the hard case down against the wall with deliberate care, straightened up, and looked at Brennan directly. "Staff Sergeant Maya Chen," she said. "Reporting as ordered, sir." Brennan did not speak for a moment. He looked at her the way he looked at equipment that had been delivered to the wrong location, not with anger yet, but with the beginning of an inventory problem. His eyes moved to the doorway briefly, as if expecting someone from logistics to appear and explain the error. "Ordered by whom?" he said. She reached into her jacket, withdrew a folded document, and crossed the room to place it on the table in front of him. She didn't hand it to him. She set it down. The distinction was small, but it was real, and Rodriguez noticed it. Brennan picked up the document. He read it. His expression did not change, but something behind his eyes shifted, some internal calculation beginning to recalibrate. The document was from JSOC, Joint Special Operations Command. It authorized the attachment of Staff Sergeant Maya Chen to FOB Sentinel in a role described as Specialized Operational Support. It carried a security classification that matched his own. It had signatures he recognized. He folded it and set it back on the table. Specialized support, he repeated. The words came out of his mouth like something he was tasting and already knew he didn't want. Yes, sir, she said. He looked at her for a long moment, then he looked at his team. He could read their faces the way he read topography maps instinctively immediately. What he saw was a mixture of confusion and the early edges of amusement. That last part bothered him more than he showed because he recognized it was contagious, and contagion was something he preferred to control. Sergeant Chen, he said, his voice dropping into the register he used when he was being formally patient, which was its own kind of warning. This is a Tier 1 operational brief. My team has been running integrated training for 7 months. We have 12 days before execution. I don't know who you are. I don't know what specialized support means in this context, and I do not incorporate unknown variables into active mission planning at this stage. Are we clear? Clear, sir, she said. She didn't add anything. She didn't defend herself. She didn't explain. She simply agreed with him and stood there. He waited for more. Nothing came. Rodriguez shifted in his seat. That particular kind of silence, cooperative on the surface, immovable underneath, was something he had encountered maybe twice in his career, and both times it had meant something. Do you have a unit? Brennan asked. Not one I can disclose in this setting, sir. Do you have operational experience? Yes, sir. We're open multiple theaters, sir. The details are compartmentalized above the current classification level of this briefing. Brennan's jaw tightened. He turned to look at Rodriguez, and the look said, find out who cleared this. Rodriguez gave a small nod and quietly pulled out his phone under the table. Holt leaned sideways toward Torres and said low enough that he thought he was being quiet, intelligence placement. Someone in D.C. called in a favor. Torres said nothing, but he was watching Chen. She gave no indication she had heard Holt. Her eyes remained on Brennan. All right, Brennan said, and the words carried the specific weight of a man who has decided to absorb something he doesn't like because fighting it at this moment serves no tactical purpose. You can observe the remainder of this brief. We'll discuss your role afterward. Thank you, sir. She moved to the back of the room. She didn't take a chair immediately. She stood first and she watched the projection on the wall with an attention so focused that Torres, who was seated closest to her, found himself glancing at her twice in the next 4 minutes. Because she wasn't watching the briefing the way an intelligence analyst watches a briefing, looking for data, noting keywords, logging information for later processing. She was watching it the way an operator watches a briefing. She was watching it the way someone who intends to be in that compound watches a briefing. Torres didn't say anything. He turned back to the front of the room, but the thought had arrived and it stayed. Brennan continued. He walked through entry vectors, timing windows, the primary target's known behavioral patterns, the secondary exfil route. He was thorough and controlled, and his briefing was by any standard excellent. He knew his material. He knew his team. He was the kind of commander who inspired confidence, not through charisma, but through sheer mastery of every detail he presented. At one point, 15 minutes into the resume briefing, Maya spoke. Sir, she said. Brennan stopped. Every head in the room turned. She had moved at some point to a chair. She had a small notebook open on her knee. She had written nothing in it that anyone could see from a distance, but she held a pen, and she had been making marks that were not words, they were diagrams. Small ones. Geometric. The Northeastern Guard rotation, she said. The timing window you've listed as 14 minutes. In my observation, it runs closer to 11. Dead silence. Brennan's expression was controlled, but something moved through his eyes that was not entirely friendly. Your observation, he repeated. Yes, sir. You have surveillance of this compound. I have spent time in the surrounding area, sir. Yes. How much time? She didn't hesitate. 18 months. The room didn't erupt. It went the other direction, quieter suddenly than it had been before. The specific quiet of people recalibrating. Rodriguez had looked up from his phone. He was staring at her now openly. Brennan did not look at his team. He kept his eyes on her and his voice professionally flat. Sergeant Chen, this compound's existence was classified at the highest operational tier. The surveillance operation surrounding it has been limited to a hand-picked team of 4 analysts working remotely. I'm aware of that, sir, she said. And yet you're telling me you have 18 months of personal, ground-level observation. Yes, sir. He stared at her for a long moment. You'll verify that with documentation after this brief, he said. Already in the packet I gave you, sir, pages 9 through 43. He looked down at the folded document on the table, then back at her. His hands were very still. Continue, she said, and then immediately added, Sir, I apologize. I only meant I didn't want to delay the brief further. Brennan looked at her for one more beat. Then he turned back to the projection. He continued, but the room was different now. Torres leaned very slightly toward Holt and said barely above a breath, intelligence placement. Holt said nothing back, because he was no longer sure that was the right category. After the briefing ended, the team filed out with the controlled efficiency of men who had somewhere specific to be. Rodriguez lingered as he sometimes did. He watched Chen as she collected her notebook and capped her pen and stood up. And he tried to read her the way he read everyone quickly, instinctively looking for the tells that people always had, whether they knew it or not. He couldn't get a read. That was unusual enough that he decided to watch longer. Brennan waited until the room was mostly empty. Then he looked at Chen directly and said quietly, pages 9 through 43. Yes, sir. Guard rotation data, behavioral pattern analysis, entry point erosion assessment. Yes, sir. You wrote these, Spice? Yes, sir. He was quiet. Then you were in that valley. For portions of the 18 months, yes, sir. Embedded in a support role with local agricultural operations, covered identity long-duration surveillance protocol. Brennan looked at her with an expression that was not warm, but was no longer exactly cold either. It was the expression of a man doing math he didn't expect to be doing. Your file is classified above my read level, he said. I've been in this business for 31 years. I have clearance on programs most of this building has never heard of, and your file is above my read level. I'm aware of that, sir, she said, and she said it gently, not triumphantly, not with any edge, just factually the way you acknowledge something that exists rather than something you chose. He turned and walked to the door. Then he stopped without turning around. Tomorrow morning, he said. Oh, 600, firing range, full kit. She said nothing. He left. Rodriguez, who had been leaning against the wall near the door, waited until Brennan's footsteps faded. Then he looked at Maya Chen with the direct, undecorated assessment of a man who had long since stopped being impressed by things that were designed to impress and had learned to pay close attention instead to things that didn't seem to be trying. You know what he's doing tomorrow, Rodriguez said. Yes, she said. He's expecting you to fail. She looked at him with calm, dark eyes and said, I know. Rodriguez nodded once. He pushed off the wall. He walked to the door and stopped the same way Brendan had. He didn't turn around either. I've been doing this for 14 years, he said. I can count on one hand the number of people I've met who knew something was coming at them and were this calm about it. He paused. I don't know if that means you're very good or very foolish. She said nothing. He left. Maya stood alone in the empty briefing room. She looked at the projection wall, now dark. She looked at the satellite image still faintly visible on the surface, the compound, the valley, the mountains she had spent a year and a half breathing in, learning in ways that no satellite could capture. She looked at the chairs where those men had sat, men who had spent their careers being the best in every room they walked into. She picked up her hard case. She picked up her duffel. She walked to the door. She was not angry. She was not nervous. She was not performing anything for anyone because there was no one left in the room to perform for. She was simply ready. That night in the cramped quarters assigned to her on the east side of the base, she sat on the edge of her bunk and did not sleep for a long time. Not because she was afraid of the morning, but because the night before a test was always the same for her. She went back through everything, not reviewing, not worrying, just visiting. The way you visit a place you know very well, walking through it in your memory, not to check that it's still there, but simply because it belongs to you. She thought about Montana, the early mornings on the ridge above the ranch cold enough to see your breath. Her father's voice behind her, steady and quiet. Don't fight the wind, understand the wind. She thought about her brother David, 24 years old when they flew him home. She had been 22. She had stood in that field in her dress uniform, and she had thought with a clarity that surprised her even now that this is what it feels like when the world asks something of you that costs everything. And she had thought, I will pay it. She thought about the SOT, IC course. 7 weeks of things that broke other people. She had not been broken. Not because she was stronger than the people who broke, but because she had already been broken once before in a field in Montana, standing next to a flag-draped casket, and she had learned something that the SOTIC instructors couldn't teach, that the far side of complete loss is a kind of clarity most people never reach, because most people never lose that much. She set the hard case on the bunk beside her. She opened the latches. She looked at it the way you look at something that is both a tool and a testament. The Barrett M82A1 50 caliber anti-material precision system, long-range elimination platform. There were snipers who used it, and there were snipers who understood it, and those were two different categories, separated by years of communion with the physics of what it could do and the discipline of what it demanded. She had qualified on it at a range that no longer officially existed under instructors whose names were not in any database accessible to anyone in this building. She closed the latches. She lay back on the bunk. Tomorrow at 0600, General Marcus Brennan was going to bring her to his range in front of his team, and he was going to watch her fail. And every person in that room, Rodriguez, Torres, Holt, all of them, was going to watch alongside him, and they were going to draw the conclusions that felt obvious to them, that felt confirmed by everything they already believed. She closed her eyes. She was not angry about that. She understood it. She had understood it from the moment she walked through that door. The thing about being underestimated, Maya Chen had learned over a long and specific career, was that it was never comfortable. People sometimes said that being underestimated is a gift, it's an advantage. And it was technically, tactically. But that framing skipped over the part where you had to stand in a room full of people who had already decided what you were and hold yourself in that silence without letting it touch you, without letting it make you smaller, without reaching for anger, because anger was just another way of letting them define the shape of you. The real skill, the one nobody talked about, was staying exactly yourself inside someone else's story about who you were. She had been practicing that for a long time. Tomorrow she would practice it again. She fell asleep with the hard case beside her and the sound of the bass settling around her. And if she dreamed, she did not remember it when 0500 came and the alarm went off in the dark. She dressed in the dark. She picked up the case. She walked out into the pre-dawn of Afghanistan and breathed in air that smelled like dust and distance and the particular silence that comes just before the world decides to show what it is. She was ready. She had always been ready. That was the thing none of them knew yet. The range at FOB Sentinel was not built for comfort. It was built for truth. And the truth it told was simple. You could either shoot or you couldn't, and the desert didn't care which one you were before you pulled the trigger. Rodriguez arrived at a 5:52. He stood off to the side with your arms crossed and said nothing to anyone. Torres came 2 minutes later, then Holt, then the rest of the team, filing in with the loose, unhurried confidence of men who already knew how the morning was going to go. They had talked the night before, not formally, not in any organized way, but the way men talk when they're in close quarters and something unusual has happened, and they need to process it without admitting they're processing it. The consensus had been quiet but clear. Intelligence placement. Someone with connections had called in a favor. She had data on the compound, probably gathered by a team she was coordinating, not by herself. The 18 months in the field, the compartmentalized file, the JSOC authorization, all of it could be explained by a desk-based analyst who had been running local assets, not someone who had actually been in that valley on foot, reading wind and terrain and the behavioral rhythms of men who wanted to kill anyone who came close. That was what they had decided. None of them said it out loud now. They didn't have to. Brennan arrived at exactly 0600. He never arrived late, and he never arrived early, because precision was not something he performed. It was something he was. He walked to the range line, looked at the target positions already set at 800, 1,200, and 1,600 meters, and turned to face the group. Maya Chen was already there. She had been there before any of them. She stood at the far left of the range line with the hard case at her feet. She was wearing the same field clothing as the day before. Her expression was quiet. Not nervous quiet, not performing calm quiet, just quiet. The way the desert itself was quiet before something moved through it. Brennan looked at her, then at the case, then back at his team. Something passed through his expression that was not quite calculation and not quite curiosity, but lived in the space between them. Sergeant Chen, he said, the qualification course this morning will be standard SEAL sniper assessment, 800 meters, 1200 meters, 1600 meters. Wind flags are live. No corrections called in. You shoot what you see. Understood, sir, she said. Holt leaned close to Torres and said very quietly, what rifle did she bring? Because if that case is what I think it is, it's not, Torres said. You don't know that. Nobody brings this. Maya bent down and opened the latches. Both men went silent. Rodriguez, standing 6 feet away, saw it first. He was the closest. He saw the case open and he saw what was inside, and he felt something shift in him, not dramatically, not with any theater, just a quiet interior movement, the way your body adjusts its balance when the ground turns out to be different from what you expected. The Barrett M82A1 lay in its foam-lined case with the specific presence of something that was not designed to impress anyone. It was designed to reach out across impossible distances and end things. It was anti-material. It was .50 caliber. It was a weapon system that the average trained operator could handle on a mechanical level, but that required a different category of mastery to use at the ranges currently marked on this course. Holt stopped talking. Torres said nothing. The rest of the team had seen it too now. The way awareness moves through a group without anyone announcing it. One man notices, then the next, and within 30 seconds, everyone on that range line knew exactly what was in that case. Brennan looked at it for a long moment. He said nothing, but his jaw moved slightly, the way it did when he was recalibrating something. Maya began to assemble it. This was the second thing that hit the room because the assembly was not tentative. It was not the careful reference movement of someone who had learned a procedure and was executing it step by step from memory. It was the movement of someone for whom the procedure had long since dissolved into the body. Her hands moved with a rhythm that was almost musical. Not fast for the sake of performance, but flowing in the way that genuine mastery flows, where nothing is wasted and nothing is performed, and the work simply happens because the person and the tool have already negotiated everything there is to negotiate. Rodriguez watched her hands. He had seen operators assemble weapons under extreme conditions, in darkness, in cold, in the specific controlled chaos of a unit operating at the edge of its limits. He had assembled weapons himself in conditions that tested everything he had, and what he was watching now, the particular quality of it, was something he had only seen a handful of times in his career. She was not thinking about what she was doing, she was just doing it. He uncrossed his arms. Brennan stood with his hands clasped behind his back, watching. His face was the face he wore in briefings, controlled observational, giving nothing away. But he was watching with a quality of attention that was different from what he'd brought to the range this morning when he arrived expecting to observe a failure. Maya seated herself behind the weapon. She settled into position the way water settles into a container, completely with no resistance, occupying exactly the space available. She did not rush. She did not pause for effect. She simply became what she needed to be, and the rifle became an extension of that. Holt started to say something. Rodriguez put one hand out sideways without looking at him. Holt closed his mouth. Silence on the range. The first target was at 800 meters. Under normal conditions, a competent sniper could make this shot. A skilled one made it consistently. 800 meters with a Barrett under morning desert conditions manageable. That was what everyone was thinking. Even if she hit it, it would prove nothing beyond basic competence. She fired. The sound rolled out across the desert like a physical thing, a beat. Then the confirmation tone from the target system. Center hit inside the ring. Nobody reacted. That was expected. That was the floor, not the ceiling. 1200, Brennan said. She adjusted. The movement was minimal, a fraction of a degree, a breath calculation, a stillness that preceded the shot like a door closing. She fired. The sound, the weight, the tone, center mass, tighter than the first shot. Rodriguez heard Torres exhale beside him, not loudly, just a slow release of breath that he probably didn't know he was making. Rodriguez understood it completely. 1600, Brennan said, and his voice just slightly, just at the edge of perceptible, had changed register. 1600 meters. That was not a standard qualification distance. That was the kind of distance that appeared in after-action reports. That was the kind of distance that had names attached to it. It was the distance where wind and heat distortion and optical physics and human physiology all conspired against the shooter. And the only thing that could beat all of them simultaneously was a combination of training instinct and something that existed underneath both of those, something that couldn't be fully taught because it had to be lived into over years of practice and pressure and loss. Maya lay behind the Barrett for a long time before this shot, not hesitating, not struggling, reading. She was reading the air the way her father had taught her on that ridge into Montana when she was 9 years old, and the wind came off the mountain in layers, and he had said, "The wind has a conversation with itself. Your job is to listen before you speak." She was listening. The range was completely silent. Brennan did not speak. Nobody spoke. And then she fired. The sound was the same. The wait was longer because at 1,600 meters, physics requires patience even after the trigger breaks. The bullet makes its own journey at its own speed through air that is trying to change it, and you wait. The tone. Center hit. Not just inside the ring. Dead center. The silence that followed was different from the silence before the shot. Before was anticipation. This was something else. This was the particular quiet of a group of professionals who have just witnessed something that has rearranged their understanding of a situation and who do not yet know what to do with that rearrangement. Holt was staring at the target display with his mouth slightly open. Torres had both arms at his sides now uncrossed, which for Torres was the equivalent of a standing ovation. Rodriguez looked at Brennan. Brennan was looking at Maya Chen. She had risen from the firing position with the same economy of movement she'd used to settle into it. She was checking the weapon, going through the post-fire procedure with methodical care. She was not looking at the target display. She was not looking at the team. She was doing what came next because that was what you did. Brennan walked toward her. The team watched him. Nobody moved. He stopped 3 feet away from her. She looked up from the weapon and met his eyes. "Where did you qualify on this platform?" he said. "I can't disclose that, sir," she said. "Classification level." "Yes, sir." He was quiet. Then, "How many confirmed long-range engagements?" She held his gaze. "That information is also compartmentalized, sir." His jaw moved again. "Give me a range." She considered for exactly 2 seconds. "More than 10, she said, "at distances comparable to what you just set. More than 10, at 1,600 meters or beyond." That was not a support role. That was not an analyst with assets in the field. That was an operator with a confirmed record that had been locked away in a file that a 31-year veteran with the clearance of General Marcus Brennan could not access. Rodriguez felt the weight of that land on him, and he let it. Brennan took a breath through his nose. Then he said, "Your SOTIC qualification. Show me." There was a murmur in the team. Not loud, just a breath of collective reaction. Because SOTIC, Special Operations Target Interdiction Course, was not something you mentioned casually. It was a program that existed in the professional consciousness of every serious long-range shooter, the way Mecca existed for the devout. A place that almost no one reached, and that changed the ones who did. There were fewer than 50 living SOTIC graduates at any given time. The attrition rate was not published. The curriculum was not discussed outside of its own walls. You either knew someone who had been through it or you didn't, and if you did, you noticed that they never brought it up themselves. Maya reached into her jacket and produced a small laminated card. She held it out. Brennan took it. He looked at it for a long time. Then he passed it to Rodriguez without a word. Rodriguez held it the way you hold something you need to be sure is real. He looked at the qualification code. He looked at the authentication markers. He looked at the date 7 years ago, which meant she had been 25 years old when she completed it. He thought about what he knew about that course and what it required, and he thought about a 25-year-old woman going through it. And he felt something that was not quite shame, because shame required having done something wrong but was related to it. Something like the recognition of an error made in ignorance, which was its own specific discomfort. He passed the card to Torres. Torres looked at it. He passed it to Holt. Holt looked at it and then looked at Maya Chen with an expression that had nothing left of amusement in it. The card made its way back to her. She pocketed it. Brennan said, "Why didn't you lead with this?" She looked at him steadily. You didn't ask, sir. I asked who you were. Yes, sir, and I told you. Staff Sergeant Maya Chen reporting as ordered. He stared at her. That's not what I meant. I know, she said, and the way she said it without accusation, without the satisfaction of being right, was somehow more pointed than any of those things would have been. Because she was saying, I know exactly what you meant, and I know what you were really asking, and I know you weren't asking about my training. You were asking about my right to be in the room, and I don't answer that question, sir, because that question isn't about who I am. It's about who you assumed I was before I walked through the door. She didn't say any of that, but it was in the air between them, clear as the desert sky. Brennan looked at her for a long moment. Then he did something that nobody on his team could remember seeing him do before in any variation of this kind of situation. He nodded, not a small nod, not a dismissive acknowledgement. A real nod, the kind you give when you have received information that has changed something in you, and you are acknowledging not just the information, but the change. Your compound data, he said. The guard rotation. 11 minutes, not 14. Yes, sir. That's a 3-minute window we've been wrong about. Yes, sir. And there are 4 other timing discrepancies in the current plan that carry comparable tactical risk. Nobody breathed. Brennan said very quietly, You're going to walk me through all of them. Yes, sir, she said. I plan to. Rodriguez looked at Torres. Torres looked back at him. Something passed between them. Not words, not even a gesture. Just the shared recognition of 2 men who had been in this business as long enough to know that they had just watched a pivot point. Not a dramatic one, not a Hollywood one, just the real kind, the kind that happens in the middle of an ordinary morning when the truth refuses to stay in the box that was built for it. Holt, for his part, was still holding the memory of that target display in his head. Center hit, dead center, 1,600 meters. He was going to be holding that memory for a long time. They walked back toward the briefing room, the team moving around Maya Chen with a different geometry than they'd used the day before. Not deferent, these were not men who deferred easily, but spacious. The way professionals move around someone they have decided to take seriously. She walked in the middle of it without seeming to notice the difference, or perhaps noticing it completely and simply continuing to be exactly herself regardless. Inside, Brennan set the revised mission documentation on the table. He looked at her. Start with the northern perimeter, and he said. She opened her notebook, and the real briefing began. Rodriguez sat in his chair and watched her walk through the compound data, not from a satellite map, but from the inside out, the way you know something, when you've been there, when you've tasted the dust and tracked the shadows and learned the rhythms of people who never knew you were watching. She spoke with the specific authority of lived knowledge, and it was a completely different thing from the authority of processed intelligence, and every man in that room could feel the difference. Torres was taking notes. He had not taken notes during the original briefing. Holt was leaning forward, both elbows on the table, the posture of someone who has stopped trying to look casual because casual has become irrelevant. Brennan sat across from her and listened, and somewhere during the first 15 minutes of that listening, a look crossed his face that Rodriguez caught and would not forget. It was not humility, not exactly. It was something harder than humility and more honest. It was the look of a man who has spent decades being the most prepared person in any given room, and who is sitting across from someone who simply knows more and who is choosing to receive that fact cleanly without ego, because the mission is more important than the mirror. That, Rodriguez thought, was also something he hadn't seen from Brennan very many times. She got to the 4th discrepancy, the eastern fallback route, which had a compromised section that the satellite imagery had missed entirely because the obstruction was below the tree line, immobile, and the room had gone from the charged silence of challenge into something else. Something that felt to Rodriguez like the beginning of a team that actually included every person in it. Maya looked up from her notebook. She looked at Brennan. He said, "How many of these errors would have cost us someone?" She held his gaze without flinching. 3 of the 5, she said. The northern timing window, the eastern route, and the secondary entry point contact protocol. Any one of those 3 under mission execution conditions carries a high probability of operator casualties. The room was very still. Brennan put both hands flat on the table. He looked at them for a moment. Then he looked up at Maya Chen. Sergeant Chen, he said. His voice was different, still controlled, still precise. But the temperature in it had changed, not warm exactly, but clean. Honest, like stripped metal. What role did you have in mind when you were ordered here? She said without any performance in it at all. Overwatch, sir, and mission planning revision. The compound has 3 viable long-range hides within my effective engagement range. I mapped them 18 months ago. I've updated the assessments twice since. 3 long-range hides, updated assessments, 18 months of ground-level intelligence that had just exposed 5 critical errors in a plan that had been considered ready for execution. Rodriguez looked at the table. He thought about the morning. He thought about the range. He thought about a 25-year-old going through SOT, IC, and coming out the other side. He thought about the fact that she had arrived at this base before dawn, before any of them, and had been waiting, not performing, waiting, not making herself visible, just actually waiting with the patience of someone who had learned that the right moment would arrive when it arrived and not before. He thought about what she had said the evening before when he'd told her he couldn't tell if she was very good or very foolish. She hadn't answered. She hadn't needed to. Brennan said Rodriguez. Rodriguez looked up. Tomorrow morning, Brennan said. Full team. We rebuild the plan from the eastern perimeter out. He paused, with Sergeant Chen in the room. Rodriguez nodded once. Brennan gathered his documents. He stood. He looked at Maya one more time, just briefly, just a look, and then he walked out of the room. The team began to move chairs, pushing back the low murmur of conversation starting. Torres stopped next to Maya as he passed. He didn't look at her directly. He looked at the table and he said quietly, "That's shot at 1600. I've seen the record board for this base." She waited. "Nobody on this team has that distance confirmed," he said. He walked out. Holt was the last to leave. He stopped at the doorway and turned around, and for the first time since she'd walked into the briefing room the day before, there was nothing in his face except straightforward honesty. "I said something last night," he said, "about intelligence placement." "I heard you," she said. He absorbed that. "I was wrong," he said. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "You'll make a better operator for knowing it." He blinked, nodded once, Hamas, left. Rodriguez was the last one still there. He was putting on his jacket. He was moving slowly the way he did when he was thinking about something more than what he appeared to be doing. He said without looking at her, "The SOTIC pin. You carry it in your jacket pocket." "Yes," she said. "Not on your uniform." "No." "Why not?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Because the people who need to know already know. And the people who don't, I'd rather they form their own opinion first." Rodriguez finally looked at her, held her gaze for a long moment. Then something shifted in his face, not a smile exactly, but the closest thing to one she'd seen from him. "Yeah," he said. He walked out. Maya stood alone in the briefing room for the second time in 2 days. The notebook was still open on the table. The compound data, the timing windows, the revised entry protocols, all of it spread out in the handwriting she'd developed over 18 months of taking notes in conditions where your hands didn't always cooperate, and the paper wasn't always dry, and the light was never what you needed it to be. She had not come here to prove anything. That was what none of them understood yet, and what she suspected Rodriguez was beginning to understand, and what Brennan might understand by the time this was over. She had come here because 12 days from now, a team of men were going to walk into that compound based on a plan that had 5 critical errors in it. And she was the one person on Earth who had spent enough time in that valley to know those errors existed. She had come because her brother had died because of errors that could have been prevented. And she had made a promise at a gravesite in Montana that she would spend the rest of her life being the person who prevented them. Not for glory, not for recognition, not to walk into a briefing room and make generals feel small. She had come because people she had never met were going to be alive in 13 days instead of dead. That was the whole of it. She closed the notebook. She picked up her rifle case. She walked toward the door and threw it and back out into the desert morning that was by now well past early and moving toward the full heat of the day. 12 days, she had work to do. 12 days before the operation, the work was not glamorous. It never was. That was something the outside world consistently misunderstood about this kind of work. The ratio of silence to action, the sheer weight of hours spent in preparation for minutes spent in execution. The men of Brennan's team understood this ratio instinctively. They had been shaped by it. What they were still adjusting to was the presence of a woman who appeared to understand it even more completely than they did. The rebuilt briefing session started the next morning at 05:30. Maya arrived at 05:15. Rodriguez noted the time when he came in at 05:20 and saw her already seated notebook open, 3 pages already covered in the compact, precise handwriting he was beginning to recognize as specifically hers, angular, economical, every mark intentional. She had the compound map laid flat on the table, and she had placed markers on it, small, precise marks made with a red pen at locations that did not correspond to anything in the original mission documentation. He looked at them without speaking, counted 7 new markers, and sat down across from her. Eastern Ridge, she said without looking up. She knew he was looking at the markers. 3 of these are firing positions I ruled out. One is a water source the enemy uses between 0400 and 0430. 2 are the approaches their rotating patrol uses when they think no one is watching, which is different from the approach they use when they know surveillance is possible. Rodriguez pulled the map closer. He studied the positions. How do you know what they do when they think no one's watching? She looked up. Because I spent 4 months not being anyone they thought about. He sat with that. Then the water source, 0400 to 0430. 30-minute window, she said. Single guard, unarmed during the approach because he carries his weapon on a sling and uses both hands on the path. He's done it the same way for 14 months. Rodriguez felt the particular quality of that information, the density of it. 14 months of behavioral observation on a single guard's water routine. That was not surveillance, that was archaeology. Brennan came in at 0528, looked at the map, looked at Maya, said nothing, and sat down. The team filtered in behind him over the next 90 seconds. Holt came in last, which was unusual for him, and he looked like he had slept badly and thought hard, which was confirmed when he sat down and immediately asked before the briefing formally began. The eastern fallback route, the compromise section. How wide is the obstruction? Maya looked at him. It was the first time he had asked a mission-specific question directly addressed to her. She answered it without any acknowledgement of the shift. Approximately 30 meters of collapsed support infrastructure. Foot passage possible for a single operator in under 45 seconds. Vehicle passage impossible without preparation. Could be prepared in advance, he said. Yes, during the pre-infiltration window if a 2-person team moves into position 6 hours early. Brennan said that changes the insertion timeline. Yes, sir, by approximately 40 minutes. Walk me through the full implication. She did. She walked them through it with the clarity and efficiency of someone who had already run the calculation multiple times and was now simply presenting the result rather than working toward it in real time. The 40-minute shift created a cascade of adjustments: guard position, timing, exfil, window comms, check-in schedule, overwatch positioning. Every adjustment had downstream effects, and she tracked all of them simultaneously, which was the specific kind of intelligence that could not be faked, could not be performed, and could not be produced by someone who had not lived inside the problem long enough to know its shape from the inside. Torres, halfway through her explanation, quietly got up and erased the original timeline from the whiteboard and began rewriting it based on what she was saying. Nobody asked him to do that. He just did it. That was the first real sign of the shift. Not the range, not the SOT, IC card. This Torres who trusted no one's intelligence until he had independently verified it, getting up and rewriting the board while she was still talking. Brennan saw it. He said nothing, but he saw it. By 800, the mission plan had been rebuilt at the structural level, not cosmetically adjusted, rebuilt. The entry vector had changed. The timing had changed. The overwatch positioning, which in the original plan had placed a spotter at a location Maya identified as compromised by heat shimmer during the operational window, had been relocated to the first of her 3 mapped hides, a position that offered a clean line to all 3 primary target zones in a concealed withdrawal route that she had physically walked 3 times over 14 months. At 8:15, Brennan called a break. The team moved, coffee appeared. The room became briefly louder, less formal, the particular shift in energy that happens when professionals who have been working at full intensity allow themselves 60 seconds of being human. Holt poured 2 cups and set one in front of Maya without comment. She looked at it, then at him. He shrugged. You've been talking for 2.5 hours. She picked up the cup. Thank you. He sat on, he looked at the revised map. When you were out there, he said, 18 months. Cover identity. You were alone. For significant portions of it, yes, she said. How do you? He stopped himself. Started again. I've done long-duration field operations. Longest was 11 weeks. I thought that was a long time. She didn't respond to that directly. She said, what sustained you through those 11 weeks? He thought about it. The team, knowing they were coming, knowing there was an end date. Yes, she said, that's what works for most people. He understood what she wasn't saying, that she had done it without that. No team coming, no fixed end date, just the mission and herself and the discipline of staying present inside a cover identity for a year and a half while collecting data that she had no guarantee anyone would ever use. He looked at her differently after that. Not with awe, Holt was too practical for awe, but with the specific respect of someone who has just measured a distance and found it larger than expected. Rodriguez, standing nearby with his own coffee, had heard the exchange. He filed it away without comment. At 08:30, Brennan called the team back to the table. He said, I want to talk about Overwatch Command Authority. The room was immediately attentive. Command Authority was not a casual topic. In the revised plan, Brennan said, Sergeant Chen is primary Overwatch from the Northern Hide. Her engagement range covers 73% of the operational zone. He paused. I'm recommending she have independent engagement authority within her zone. Independent engagement and authority meant she could make the decision to fire without waiting for confirmation. In a fluid operation with communication potential compromised, it could mean the difference between a team member surviving or not. It was also a level of trust that Brennan did not extend easily to anyone. The room was quiet. Rodriguez said supported. Torres said agreed. Holt looked at his coffee, then at the map, then at Brennan. What's her communication protocol with the assault element? Brennan looked at Maya. She said 3-channel. Primary breach confirmation goes through Rodriguez as assault lead. Secondary threats within my zone I call and engage simultaneously with a 1-second voice notification. If communication drops entirely, I operate on the pre-established threat hierarchy we'll map in the next session. Holt nodded. That works, he said. And then he said it again slightly differently, as if affirming it for himself. That works. Brennan moved on. The morning session ended at 1100. The team dispersed for equipment checks and individual preparation. Maya remained at the table, updating her notebook with the confirmed timing changes, working through the final numbers on the Overwatch position, geometry. She was aware of the moment when the room emptied completely because it had its own sound. The last footstep, the door settling into its frame, the specific quality of a space that has shifted from occupied to yours alone. She worked in that quiet for 20 minutes before she became aware that someone had come back in. She didn't look up immediately. She finished the notation she was making. Then she looked up. It was Brennan. He was standing near the door with a mug in his hand. He had the posture of a man who had come back for a reason but had not yet decided how to begin. She waited. He said, You had the revised plan before you walked in here. It was not a question. A version of it, she said. How complete? 70%. I needed the team's operational specifics to complete the remaining 30. He nodded slowly. You came in with a plan that was mostly finished and let us build it as if we were discovering it together. I presented the intelligence, she said. Your team built the plan. That's accurate. He looked at her. That's a distinction you're drawing. Yes, sir. Why does it matter to you? She set her pen down. She looked at him directly. Because in 12 days, your team is going to walk into a compound in the dark under fire making real-time decisions. They need to own this plan completely. They need to know it in their bodies, not just in their heads. If I hand it to them finished, it's my plan. If they build it, it's theirs, she paused. And their plan will keep them alive. Brennan stood very still. He had been commanding operators for 31 years. He had dealt with intelligence analysts and mission advisors and political attachments and joint command complications of every variety. He had learned over that time to categorize people quickly, not because he was careless, but because the operational tempo of his world demanded it. He looked at her and understood with the specific clarity that comes from genuine surprise that he had categorized her wrong, completely wrong, not just in degree, not just underestimated her skill, but in kind. He had put her in the wrong category entirely. She was not support. She had never been support. He said, "How many operations have you run in this capacity?" She said, "Enough that I don't count them anymore, sir." He absorbed that. Then he said, "Your brother." Her expression did not change visibly, but something behind it shifted, a small movement deep, like something adjusting to weight. "It's in your file," he said. "The parts I can read." "Yes, sir." "Afghanistan, 2016. "Yes, sir." He was quiet for a moment, not the silence of someone waiting for more, but the silence of someone who was choosing how to say something carefully. "I lost a soldier in 2009, he said. "Sergeant, First Class Aaron Price. He died because the intelligence we had on a compound was 14 minutes off on a guard rotation." The air in the room changed. He continued, "I have thought about that 14-minute error every day since. I have thought about what it would have meant to have someone on that mission who had been on the ground long enough to know the difference." He looked at her steadily. "I am telling you this so you understand why the errors you found in this plan matter to me at a level that goes beyond the operational." She held his gaze. "I understand, sir," she said. And the way she said it, not with sympathy, not with the performance of empathy, but with the clean acknowledgement of someone who carried the same specific weight, told him that she did understand, that she understood it not abstractly, but from the inside. He nodded once. He turned to leave. At the door, he stopped. He turned back. "Sergeant Chen," he said, "when this is over, when we're back here and the mission is closed." He paused. "I want your full file red level extended to this command." She said, "I'll make the request, sir." He left. She sat in the silence he left behind. She thought about 2009. She thought about a 14-minute error and a man named Aaron Price. She thought about David and about the specific arithmetic of preventable deaths, how they accumulated in this business. Not through malice, but through gaps, through the spaces between what you knew and what you needed to know, and how those gaps could be measured in minutes and in lives simultaneously. She picked up her pen. She went back to work. The next 9 days were the most intense preparation she had been part of in years, which was saying something. The team ran the revised plan until it was not a plan anymore, until it was reflex, until it was the automatic grammar of a shared language spoken without translation. They ran it in daylight and darkness. They ran it with communication intact and with communication severed. They ran it with simulated obstacles at the compromised Eastern Road, timing the single operator foot passage until it dropped below 40 seconds consistently. Maya ran the Overwatch geometry alongside each simulation, tracking the assault element from her map position, calling her engagement sequence into the radio with the calm of someone reading a weather report. The team at first had to consciously remember she was there, a voice in their earpiece from a position they couldn't see. By day 5, they had stopped consciously remembering it. She had become part of the operational rhythm. The way a well-placed instrument becomes part of a composition, present necessary, noticed only when absent. On day 7, Rodriguez was running the breach sequence for the 6th time when his radio crackled and Maya's voice came through. "Rodriguez, stop. Secondary contact 9 o'clock outside your field, 8 seconds. He stopped. He looked left. There was nothing there. It was a training simulation. But his body had stopped before his mind had finished processing the order. And that automatic response to her voice was the confirmation that the integration was complete. He said into his radio, "Good call." She said, "He was walking the inner perimeter. Would have been on top of your position in 45 seconds. He filed that away. He had not seen the contact in the simulation map. She had, from her position through her scope, tracking a detail that was outside the primary mission geometry, but within her zone. That evening, Holt found Rodriguez doing equipment maintenance in the gear room. He said, "She called a secondary contact on the day 7 run that wasn't in the simulation parameters." Rodriguez looked up. "Instructor added it," Holt said, 10 minutes before the run. "Nobody on the assault element was briefed on it. She caught it from Overwatch position before any of us knew it was there." Rodriguez set down what he was holding. He thought about that. "She reads the whole field," he said. "She reads the whole field," Holt confirmed. They sat with that for a moment. Holt said, "I've been in this unit for 4 years. I've worked with some exceptional people." He paused. "He's different," Rodriguez said. "Different how Holt thought about it. And it's not just the skill. Lots of people have exceptional skill." He was quiet for a moment. "She's present in a way that's different." Like there's nothing in her back head except what's happening right now. No noise, no performance. Just he searched for the word. Attention, complete attention, all the time. Rodriguez nodded. He had noticed the same thing and had not found the words for it until now. Montana, he said. Holt looked at him. She grew up on a ranch. Her father trained her from childhood. Long-range discipline, patience, reading environment. Rodriguez picked up what he'd set down and went back to the maintenance. Some things you can learn in a training program. Some things have to be built into you before you're old enough to know you're being built. Holt thought about that for a while. On the morning of day 10, Brennan called a final full-team briefing. The plan was complete. The timing was confirmed. The communication protocols were established and tested. The Overwatch geometry was mapped in everyone's memory, not just on paper. Every person in that room could have described every element of the operation from any other person's position, which was the standard Brennan always demanded before execution. He walked through this final confirmation sequence. He got to Overwatch. He said, Sergeant Chen, Northern Hyde, Independent Engagement Authority within zone, communication primary through Rodriguez. He paused. Confirm. She said, confirm, sir. He looked around the room. Any questions? Any concerns? Now. Nobody spoke. Then Torres said, one question. Everyone looked at him. Torres rarely asked questions in final briefings. When he did, they mattered. The compound's northern internal position, he said. The target's known security lead. He moves unpredictably in the final 30 minutes before shift change. Our intelligence has him in 3 different locations in that window, depending on the night. He looked at Maya. You've watched him for 18 months, he said. Is there a pattern inside the unpredictability? The room waited. Maya was quiet for 4 seconds, not hesitating, thinking. Actually thinking in the specific way she thought about things that she had observed without knowing she was building a conclusion. Yes, she said, he favors the northwest corner of the internal courtyard when he's anxious. Not the position, the direction. He faces northwest when something is bothering him. When the shift change is smooth and he's relaxed, he stands east. The night of the operation, if he's facing northwest. He knows something, Rodriguez said. Or suspects something, she said. Which is operationally equivalent. Brennan said, and if he's facing east, then we're inside his operational comfort window and we proceed as planned. Brennan looked at Torres. Torres gave a small nod. Brennan turned back to the room. 48 hours, he said. Get your rest. Check your equipment twice. We executed 0200 day after tomorrow. He paused. I want everyone back in this room at 2200 tomorrow night for final check. No exceptions. The team began to disperse. Rodriguez paused at the door. He looked back at Maya, who was making a final notation in her notebook. He said northwest corner. She looked up. If he's in the northwest corner, Rodriguez said, what do we do? She held his gaze. We adapt, she said, together. He nodded. He walked out. Maya closed her notebook. She sat for a moment in the empty room with the completed plan in her head. All of it, every thread, every timing, window, every contingency. She had built this over 18 months of ground-level work and 10 days of integration, and it was as solid as anything she had ever put together. She thought about David. She thought about what it meant to do everything within your power so that the people walking into danger walk back out of it. She thought about 2 days from now at 0200 in the dark over a compound in Afghanistan with the Barrett settled into her shoulder and the whole operational zone inside her scope. She thought about being ready. She was. The final check-in at 2200 the night before the operation was quieter than any briefing that had come before it. There was a different quality to the silence in that room. Not the silence of tension, not the silence of doubt, but the specific silence of people who have done everything they can do and have arrived at the edge of the only part that cannot be prepared for. The part where you go. Brennan stood at the front of the room and looked at his team one by one. He had done this before every operation for 31 years. He had looked at the faces of men who came back and the faces of men who didn't. And he had learned to stop trying to read the difference in advance because the difference was never where you expected it to be. What he looked for now was simply presence. Were they here? Were they in the room in their bodies in the mission? Were they ready? He got to Maya. She was present in a way that was almost architectural. She sat with her notebook closed on the table in front of her, her hands resting on it, her eyes on him. She was not performing readiness. She was simply ready, and the difference between those two things was visible if you knew what to look for. He moved through the final confirmation sequence in 12 minutes. Every element checked, every contingency confirmed. Those communication protocols verified, exfil timing locked. He ended with Overwatch as he always ended with the most isolated element, because the most isolated element was always the one most at risk of becoming untethered. Sergeant Chen, he said, Northern Hide, insertion 0130, operational window open 0200. You are dark from insertion to breach confirmation. Dark meant no communication. 30 minutes alone in position with the Barrett in the night, in the compound spread out below her scope, watching and waiting and making no sound. Confirmed, sir, she said. He held her gaze for one beat longer than the others. Not as a question, as an acknowledgement. She received it the same way. Get rest, he said. What rest you can, 0045 assembly. The room emptied. Rodriguez stayed behind as he had the habit of doing. He looked at Maya as she stood and picked up her notebook. You'll be 30 minutes dark before we move, he said. Yes. Anything happens in that window, unexpected contact position, compromise, you are making the call alone. Yes, he looked at her steadily. I need to know you are comfortable with that. She looked back at him with the direct, unhurried gaze he had come to recognize as specifically hers, the gaze of someone who does not waste energy on uncertainty about things that have already been decided. Rodriguez, she said, I spent 14 months alone in that valley. 30 minutes is a rest. Something moved through his face that was almost a smile. He nodded once and walked out. She did not sleep. She lay on her bunk in the dark, with her eyes open, and ran the operation from beginning to end. In her mind, not anxiously, she had done the preparation. The preparation was complete, but the way a musician runs a piece before a performance. Not to check whether she knew it. She knew it. She ran it because the running of it was itself a form of presence, a way of being already there before she was physically there. She thought about the Northern Hide. She had mapped it 14 months ago on a clear morning, when the air was cold enough that she could see her own breath, and the compound below was waking up guards changing the specific behavioral signatures of men beginning their day, the small patterns that added up over time to the intelligence that had just rebuilt an entire mission plan. She had lain in that position for 4 hours on the original survey, which was not surveillance, it was communion. That was the word that came to her now, lying in the dark on the base. Communion with the space, with the angles, with the way the light moved and the wind behaved and the ground held her. She would know that Hide the way she knew her own hands. She would settle into it, and it would receive her, and the Barrett would find its position. And the scope would open the world below her into the specific clarity that was her professional instrument. David, she thought, I'm going to bring them home. She got up at 0:30, dressed, checked the Barrett with the lights on for the last time, each component, each setting, each interface between herself and the weapon that would determine whether what she saw through that scope translated into the protection of the men moving below her. Everything was correct. Everything was exactly what it needed to be. She was at the assembly point at 0043. She was the first one there. Rodriguez arrived at 0045 exactly. He looked at her, looked at the hard case, said nothing. The team assembled around them in the next 4 minutes, Torres with the systematic efficiency of a man who has packed and checked and packed again. Holt with the specific focused quiet that Maya had learned was his pre-operational state, the external stillness of a mind running very fast internally. The rest of the team with the particular collective energy of people moving towards something that requires everything they have. Brennan came last. He looked at the team. He said, move. They moved. The insertion was in 2 elements. The assault team moved by a vehicle to the base of the eastern approach. The route Maya had revised the route that had been tested and timed until it was owned and would approach the compound on foot from there. Maya's insertion was separate. She went north, extracted by a small vehicle to within 2 kilometers of the Hide, and from there she moved alone. The separation happened without ceremony. Rodriguez looked at her once as the vehicles diverged. She looked back. Then she was moving north and they were moving east, and the night was absolute around all of them. She reached the Hide at 0118, 12 minutes ahead of the insertion timeline, which was exactly what she had planned. She needed those 12 minutes not for setup would take 4, but for settling. For the specific process of becoming still enough that her own heartbeat became a variable she could account for rather than a disturbance she had to work around. She assembled into position with the economy she had practiced for years. The Barrett found its place. The bipod settled. The scope aligned to the first reference point, the main gate of the compound 1,340 meters distant, which was the anchor from which she would range everything else. She confirmed the distance. She confirmed wind. She confirmed her holdover adjustments for the temperature differential between the hide and the target zone. She ran through it in 40 seconds. Then she went still. Dark. No communication. The operation clock running in her head, not anxiously, just running. The way time runs when you are somewhere between waiting and being. Below her, the compound was alive with the specific rhythm she had memorized. The Northern Guard's timing, 11 minutes confirmed. The inner courtyard, which she could see partially through the main gate, and the gap in the western wall that the satellite imagery had missed and she had mapped on foot. The position of the lights. The behavioral signatures she had been reading for 18 months, now playing out in real time against the backdrop of an operation that had 12 days of preparation and 18 months of intelligence behind it. At 1:39, she saw something. The security lead, the one Torres had asked about in the final briefing, the one whose position in the final 30 minutes of shift change carried meaning, was in the courtyard. She found him in the scope. He was facing northwest. Her breathing did not change. Her position did not shift. But something in her mind went immediately to a different level of attention the way the circuit activates, and she ran the implications in the 3 seconds she had before she needed to make a decision about what to do with the information. Northwest. He knew something, or suspected something. The assault team was 7 minutes from the breach point. She had no communication until breach confirmation. She could not warn them. She could not change the approach. She could not adjust the plan. What she could do was track him, watch every movement, and be ready to respond to whatever he had been tipped about before the assault element walked into it. She held. At 01:47, the security lead moved. He crossed the courtyard, not the routine crossing she had documented, not the habitual path, but a direct line to the northern wall where he stopped and looked toward the approach route, not toward her hide, away from it, toward the eastern approach. Her mind processed that in a fraction of a second. He wasn't looking toward her. He was looking east, which meant whatever he suspected was coming from the east, which meant the assault element's approach route. She ran the geometry. The assault team would be at the base of the eastern wall in approximately 4 minutes. The security lead was at the northern wall, which gave him a sightline to the path they would be using in 3 minutes and 40 seconds. She had to work with what she had. She watched the security lead. She tracked his breathing through the scope, the rise and fall of his shoulders, the specific quality of attention in his posture. She read him the way she had read wind on a Montana ridge 30 years earlier, and in this valley 18 months ago, and in training programs that no one outside of a very small community knew existed. He was not raising an alarm. He was watching. He had a suspicion, not a confirmation. If he got the confirmation, if he saw something in the next 3 minutes, he would raise the alarm, and the assault team would be walking into an alerted compound with every advantage gone. She had one option. She checked her engagement authorization. The security lead was within her zone. He was a confirmed hostile. He had not yet committed a triggering action. He was watching, not shooting, not communicating, which meant she was at the edge of her independent engagement authority, but had not crossed into it. She tracked him. 45 seconds passed. He shifted his weight. He raised his hand to the radio at his shoulder. That was the line. She fired. The sound rolled across the dark and was absorbed by it. At 1,340 meters with the suppressor on the Barrett and the ambient sound of the valley, it was not silence, but it was close enough that the men inside the compound did not immediately know what they had heard. The security lead dropped. She was already recalibrating to the next position, the inner courtyard guard who had reacted to the sound and was moving toward the northern wall. She tracked him for 2 seconds, confirmed he was reaching for his radio, and fired again. 2 shots, 2 targets, 4 seconds total. At 01:51, her radio crackled once the pre-breach signal from Rodriguez. They were at the wall, they were going in. She answered with the single click that meant clear. Then the operation opened up. Breach at 0152. Rodriguez's voice in her earpiece controlled fast the specific cadence of a man executing something he knows in his bones. Breach confirmed, moving to primary. She was already scanning the inner zone. Two guards reacting to the breach sound moving from their positions toward the primary entry. She called them before Rodriguez could see them. Two movers inner zone converging on your position from the south. 8 seconds. Rodriguez said nothing. He didn't have to. She heard the sound of the team adjusting a shift in footsteps, a repositioning, and then silence, and then the specific controlled sounds of the threat being neutralized before it could become a problem. Clear, Torres said. She was already moving to the next angle. The vehicle bay on the western side, the detail the original plan had almost missed entirely, had a guard who was not on the rotation she had documented. A seventh man, which she had flagged in the revised plan as a variable. He was there now, and he was moving with the specific, purposeful urgency of someone who had just heard something and was deciding what to do about it. She tracked him. He reached the vehicle. He reached for something inside it. She engaged. "Western vehicle bay clear," she said into the radio. "Possible communication equipment in the vehicle. Recommend secondary check on exfil." Rodriguez, copy. The operation was running at a pace that was faster than any of the simulations, because the simulations had assumed more noise, more confusion, more reaction time from the opposition. What they were getting instead was the operational result of having an overwatch element that had read this compound for 18 months, who had pre-identified the threats before the breach so efficiently that the assault team was moving through a space that was being cleared ahead of them in real time. Holt's voice came on, "Secondary structure clear, moving to primary target location." Brennan monitoring from the command element. "Copy. Chen, what's your read on the upper level?" She had been watching the upper level since the breach. One figure stationary on the south side, not moving, not responding to the noise below in the way a guard would respond. "Upper level south," she said. "Single figure, non-responsive to breach noise. Posture inconsistent with security personnel." Brief silence from Brennan. "Description," he said. "Seated, no visible weapon, has not moved in 4 minutes despite active breach, sounds below." Another beat. Brennan said, "That's our target." Rodriguez, "Confirmed approach to upper level, 30 seconds. She kept the upper level in her scope. The figure remained still. She watched for any sign of a secondary threat, anyone approaching the figure's position from inside, anyone who might be with the target who hadn't been visible before. She found nothing. The upper level was clean. "Upper level, clear of secondary threats," she said. "Your approach is clear." Rodriguez's team moved. She tracked their movement through the compound by sound and by the radio communications, by the specific timing of Torres's breach calls and Holt's position confirmations, and she matched those sounds against the visual field she had in her scope, building a three-dimensional picture of where everyone was and where every threat was or had been. At 0204, Rodriguez said, "Target secured, upper level, we have him." 12 minutes after breach. The compound had been running for 18 months in her intelligence files, had been the subject of 10 days of integrated planning, and had been penetrated in 12 minutes without a single casualty on the assault element. She kept her position. The operation was not over until exfil was confirmed. She would hold until the last operator was off the compound grounds. She had been in this hide for 46 minutes. She would be in it for however long it took. Brennan's voice came on the command channel. "Chen, status." "Holding," she said. "All external zones clear. No additional movement detected since last engagement. Exfil route is clean." "Copy," he said. And then just after the operational pause, just slightly outside the formal communication cadence, in the space where the mission voice and the human voice could briefly be the same thing, he said, "Good work." She said, "Copy that, sir." She did not move. She held her position and kept the scope running and tracked the exfil route for the assault team as they moved back through the compound and out the eastern wall and down the path that had been tested and confirmed and cleared. She called 2 positional checks on potential contacts, both cleared without engagement, and maintained overwatch until Rodriguez's voice said, "All elements clear of compound grounds. Exfil moving." She began her breakdown sequence. The Barrett came apart with the same fluid efficiency as it had come together, each component returning to the case in the specific order that protected it and permitted fastest reassembly if needed. She closed the latches. She stood. She was alone on the northern ridge in the dark, with the compound silent below her, and the operation complete in her earpiece, and the cold, clean air of the Afghan morning beginning its slow transaction with the coming light. She stood there for exactly 1 minute, not for sentiment, not for ceremony, but because this was what she did. She stood in the place where the work had happened, and she let it settle, let the reality of it become real in the specific way that only stillness permitted. She had done it in 14 other locations over the course of her career, in different countries, in different weather, at different distances. She had done it alone every time. This time was different in one way. This time, 12 men were walking out of a compound intact because the plan had been right. Not perfectly right. Plans were never perfectly right, but right enough and flexible enough and known deeply enough by the people executing it that when it needed to flex, they had flexed with it. She thought about Rodriguez and the Eastern approach, with 2 movers converging on his position and 8 seconds to respond. She thought about his footsteps shifting before she had even finished the sentence, the reflex of a man who trusted the voice in his earpiece completely. She thought about Torres rewriting the board on day 2 without being asked. She thought about Holt bringing her coffee and asking what sustained her through the long duration, and the specific honesty of his face when she hadn't answered directly. She thought about Brennan, who had 31 years of being the most prepared person in the room, saying good work over an operational radio in the dark and meaning every word of it. She picked up the case. She began moving south toward the extraction point, through the dark that was beginning just barely, just at the very edge of perception to carry the first suggestion of coming light. David, she thought, did you see that? She kept moving. She reached the extraction point at 0231. The vehicle was already there. The driver, a young specialist named Okafor, who had been doing extraction runs for 8 months and who had learned not to ask questions about what people carried in hard cases, said nothing when she climbed in. He simply drove. She sat in the back with the Barrett across her knees and the operational clock still running in her mind, tracking the assault element's exfil timeline by habit, the way you track breathing not consciously, just as part of being alive and present in the situation. Rodriguez's voice came through her earpiece at 0238. All elements at primary exfil, loading now. She said, copy, extraction element clear, ETA to base 14 minutes. He said, see you on the other side. It was a small thing, a routine communication, but it was the first time Rodriguez had closed a radio exchange with her using a personal register rather than a purely operational one. And she noticed it the way you notice a door opening in a wall you had assumed was solid. She looked out the window at the dark and let herself, for the first time since 0130, take a full breath that was not operationally calibrated. Just a breath, just air. The base came up in the headlights at 0245. When she walked through the gate with the case in her hand, the duty officer at the checkpoint looked at her and then looked past her, clearly expecting the rest of a team to follow. She was alone. He stamped her through without a word. She went to her quarters. She broke down the Barrett one final time with the lights on, doing the post-operation inspection with the methodical care that her training required and that her own standards would have required even without the training. She checked every component. She logged the round count. She documented the engagement record in the small encrypted field journal she carried everywhere, not because she had to, but because accuracy was its own discipline, and she had never permitted herself to be sloppy about it, even when no one was watching, especially when no one was watching. That was the thing about the work that almost no one understood from the outside. The discipline was not for the moments when it was being observed. The discipline was for the moments when no one was watching, which were the moments that built the foundation for every moment when everything mattered. You couldn't reach into yourself in a crisis and find something that wasn't already there. You had to put it there first in all the quiet, ordinary moments that seemed like nothing, and trust that it would be waiting for you when you needed it. She finished the inspection at 0317. She closed the case. She sat on her bunk. She didn't sleep. She sat and let the operation replay in her mind, not searching for errors, not performing a debrief, just letting it move through her the way water moves through a place that has been shaped to receive it. The security lead facing northwest, the decision to engage, the 2 shots, Rodriguez's team adjusting without hesitation, Torres clearing the secondary structure, Holt's voice on the upper level controlled and precise, the target secured at 0204. 12 minutes. No casualties. She thought about 2009. About Aaron Price, whom she had never met, who had died because of a 14-minute error in a guard rotation, and about Brennan carrying that for 15 years, in the way that certain losses get carried not on the surface, not obviously, but in the structural, load-bearing places, the places that determine how a person stands. She thought about David. And then she thought about something she had not let herself think about in a long time, because it was the kind of thought that could undo you if you let it arrive before you were ready for it. She thought about whether she had done enough. Not operationally, the answer was clear and documented. She meant at the larger level. The level of the promise she had made at a gravesite in Montana with the flag folded in her hands, and the certainty that this loss had to mean something, had to translate into something, had to become the thing that prevented other losses, rather than simply joining the long accumulation of them. She sat with that thought, and then quietly she let herself say yes. At 06:30, the assault team returned to base. She heard them before she saw them, the sound of vehicles' voices, the particular noise of men coming off an operation and returning to the baseline of existing in a place where they were not immediately in danger. There was a specific quality to that sound, a specific register of voices that she had learned to read over years of this kind of work. What she heard this morning was that specific quality, and underneath it, something that was not quite celebration but lived adjacent to it, the low, continuous energy of people who had just done something that worked. She was standing near the briefing room entrance when Rodriguez came through the gate. He was carrying his kit bag over his left shoulder and his rifle in his right hand, and he was talking to Torres. And when he saw her, he stopped talking mid-sentence. He looked at her. She waited. He crossed the distance between them in 6 strides and stopped in front of her. And for a moment, he just looked at her with an expression she had not seen from him before. For open in a way that his face normally was not, the professional composure briefly set aside like a coat you take off when you finally get home. The northwest corner, he said. Yes, she said. You saw him? At 0139. He absorbed that. You were dark for 21 minutes with that information. Yes. And you held. There was nothing else to do, she said. The plan was the plan. My job was to be ready when the moment came. He was quiet for a moment. Then, you put him down at 0151, 11 seconds before we hit the wall. 9 seconds, she said. He almost smiled. Then he did smile briefly, the full version of it which she had not seen before and which changed his face into something younger and less guarded. He put out his hand. She shook it. It was a firm grip and a direct one, and it lasted exactly as long as it needed to, and not a moment longer. And in that handshake was everything that 2 professionals communicate to each other when words would either understate or overstate the thing that needs to be said. Torres came up beside Rodriguez. He looked at her. He said without preamble, the vehicle in the Western Bay. You called it before I even knew it was in the plan. It was in the revised plan, she said. Page 31, variable contact Western Vehicle Bay. He stared at her. I read that plan 6 times. It was a footnote, she said. He made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but contained a laugh's essential quality. He shook his head slowly. A footnote, he said mostly to himself. He looked at her one more time, then nodded the deep nod of genuine respect, the kind that takes years to earn from a man like Torres, and walked inside. Holt came through this gate with the rest of the team and stopped when he saw her. He looked like a man who had run 100 miles and slept not at all, and found on the other side of that something that he had not expected to find. He looked like a man who had been changed by something and was only beginning to know what the change was. He said 8 seconds, she said 8 seconds. You called 2 movers with 8 seconds on the clock, and Rodriguez had already moved before you finished the sentence. He's good, she said. We're all good, Holt said. That's not, he stopped, started again. He was looking at her with the direct, slightly uncomfortable honesty of someone who has something to say that cost them something. I was wrong about you from the beginning. Not just a little wrong, completely wrong. Wrong in the way that, he searched for the word, wrong in the way where you look back at it afterward and you don't actually understand how you were that wrong. She looked at him steadily. He said, I said something on that first night about intelligence placement. I heard you, she said. You apologized. I know I did, he said, but I want to say it again, Because the first time I said it before I knew what I was apologizing for. Now I know, and it's a bigger apology. She was quiet for a moment, then she said, Holt, you adjusted. When it mattered, you adjusted completely. That's all anyone can ask. He looked at her. Something settled in his face. He nodded. He walked inside. She stood at the entrance for a moment longer in the early morning light that was now fully arrived, the desert around the base beginning to take on its daytime character, hotter, starker, less forgiving. She stood in it and breathed it and thought about nothing specific for exactly 30 seconds, which was the particular rest she allowed herself between the end of one thing and the beginning of the next. Then Brennan appeared. He had come from the command building, not from the vehicle convoy. He had been in the operations room monitoring the exfil in real time, which was standard for him on any mission he was not personally running in the field. He walked toward her with the deliberate pace of a man who has something specific to do and is going to do it correctly. He stopped in front of her. For a moment, he didn't speak. He looked at her with the same quality of open attention she had seen cross his face in the briefing room 12 days ago when she had told him about the 5 timing errors, the expression of a man doing honest math. He said 11 seconds. 9, she said. He almost smiled. Rodriguez said 11. Rodriguez was moving, she said. His clock was running fast. Brennan was quiet. Then he said, you saw the northwest corner at 01:39. Yes, sir. You held for 21 minutes with that information and no communication. Yes, sir. Walk me through the decision, he said. She said the plan was confirmed and the team was inside the approach. Changing the plan at that point without communication would have been more dangerous than executing with heightened overwatch. The security lead was not yet committed. He was watching, not communicating. As long as he stayed in that posture, the plan held. When he moved to the radio, the plan required me to act. So I acted. Brennan looked at her for a long time. He said, in 1998, I made a call in a similar situation, different theater. I had information that suggested compromise, and I changed the plan unilaterally in the field without communication. 2 men were injured in the confusion of the unannounced adjustment. She waited. You made the right call, he said, holding, waiting for the commit, trusting the plan in your own ability to respond to the deviation. He paused. I didn't make that call in 1998. I was 33 years old and I had less patience than I thought I did. She said, you've had 30 years since 1998 to build it. He looked at her. Something moved through his expression, a complexity that she recognized because it was the complexity of a person who has just received something from someone they had underestimated and who is choosing to receive it without the defense mechanism of converting it into something else. He said, I want to talk about your permanent attachment. She was still. I've been authorized to request it, he said. JSOC will require your agreement. The attachment would be to this unit, this command for a minimum of 18 months with review at that point. She said, what changed? He said, nothing changed. That's the answer. Nothing about you changed. You were what you were when you walked through that door. He stopped. He looked at something past her for a moment and then back. I looked at you and I saw what I expected to see, not what was actually there. And I have spent 31 years telling young operators that the most dangerous thing in the field is a fixed expectation, meeting a complex reality. He paused. I failed my own standard. The honesty of that, the directness of it, the absence of self-protection was not something she had expected. She had expected the offer. She had not expected this. She said, sir, with respect, you adjusted. When the evidence came in, you adjusted completely and immediately. You rebuilt the plan. You extended engagement authority. You trusted the intelligence. She paused. That's not failure. That's leadership. He looked at her. She said, the failure would have been not adjusting. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, is that how you'd like me to think about it? It's how I think about it, she said, because it's accurate. He nodded slowly. Then the permanent attachment. I'll agree to it, she said, on one condition. His eyebrows rose very slightly. In 31 years, not many people had offered conditions to General Marcus Brennan. She said, the mission planning process stays the way we built it for this operation. Ground-level intelligence integrated from the start, not appended at the end. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, that's not a condition. That's a standard. Yes, sir, she said, it is. He extended his hand. She shook it. At 0800, Brennan called the full team into the briefing room. He did not hold this kind of meeting often. A full team after action debrief? Yes, that was standard. But this was something different, which everyone in the room understood from the quality of the silence when he entered, from the way he stood and looked at them before speaking. He said, Mayor, Operation Nightfall is closed. Objective secured. 0 casualties on our element. Full exfil completed at 0238. He paused. This outcome was not inevitable. 12 days ago, this operation had 5 critical errors in it that carried a high probability of operator casualties. Those errors were identified and corrected because of intelligence that was 18 months old and operationally superior to everything we had developed through conventional channels. Every head in the room was turned toward him. None of them looked at Maya, which told her they were all very aware of her. Brennan continued, I want to be specific about what happened in this room 12 days ago, because I have a responsibility to be honest with this team about my own conduct. When Sergeant Chen arrived at this base, I assessed her without information. I placed her in a category based on appearance and assumption, not evidence. I challenged her in a way that was not consistent with the professional standards I hold this team to. He paused. I was wrong. And I want every person in this room to understand that the standard I failed, the standard of assessing capability rather than appearance, is not waivable. Not for me, not for anyone. The room was completely still. Brennan looked at Maya directly. Sergeant Chen, this team is requesting your permanent attachment. Speak for yourself. She looked at the room. She looked at Rodriguez, who was watching her with the quiet focus she had come to know as his form of full attention. Torres, whose arms were uncrossed, both hands flat on the table, his version of open. Holt, who was looking at her with the straightforward honesty he had been building toward since day 2. The rest of the team, faces she had been reading for 12 days, men whose operational rhythms she knew, now the way you know, music you have played many times. She said, I'm in. Nobody cheered. These were not men who cheered, but something moved through the room, a collective exhale, a shift in the quality of the silence that was more honest and more lasting than any cheer would have been. Afterward, when the room had cleared and the day had begun its operational rhythms, and the base had returned to the specific busyness of a unit that has just closed one mission and will soon begin preparing for the next, Rodriguez found her in the gear room, running a final inventory check on the barrack components. He said, Montana. She looked up. He said, your father. The ranch, is he still there? She said, he died 4 years ago. He was quiet. I'm sorry. He knew what I was doing, she said. He understood why. That was enough. Rodriguez leaned against the wall. He was quiet for a moment. Then, you said your brother's name was David. Yes. How old was he? 24, she said. He would be 32 now. Rodriguez looked at the wall across from him. I had a teammate named Marcus, 2014, Helmand Province. He paused. He would have liked you. She looked at him. She understood what he was giving her, not just information, but the specific weight of a name, the specific trust of saying a name out loud to someone who had not been there and making them real for a moment in the air between two people who understood what names like that cost. She said Marcus would have liked your 9-second clock. He looked at her. The almost smile became the full one again. He said 9 seconds. Don't let Rodriguez hear you say that, she said. He'll argue. He laughed. An actual laugh, short and real, the laugh of a man who has carried something heavy for a long time and found unexpectedly a moment of genuine lightness inside it. He pushed off the wall. Get some rest, he said. Brennan's already talking about the next target package. She looked at him. He was walking toward the door and he said over his shoulder, he requested your read level extension this morning. Before 0800 briefing. First thing he did when he got off the command channel. She went back to the inventory. First thing he did. She thought about that. She thought about a man who had spent 31 years being the most prepared person in every room, who had looked at a woman with a hard-sided case and made a judgment that cost him 12 days of preparation and the near loss of people he was responsible for, and who had responded to that error not with defensiveness, not with the complicated machinery of pride protecting itself, but with a clean and direct correction that asked nothing of her except her continued presence. That was rare. She had encountered in her career a great many people who were capable of recognizing an error. She had encountered very few who were capable of owning it the way Brennan had owned this one, Not just privately, not just to her, but in front of the entire team on the record with specificity and without excuse. She thought about David again. She thought about what he would have said. He would have said, "So you found your team." She closed the case. She sat for a moment in the quiet of the gear room with the Barrett secured and the operation closed and the permanent attachment confirmed and the next target package already forming somewhere in the operational pipeline that would eventually bring her back to this room, this table, this team. She was not Staff Sergeant Maya Chen's specialized support. She was not the woman who didn't belong in the room. She was not the intelligence placement, the political favor, the question mark that nobody in that first briefing could answer. She was Overwatch. She was the Northern Hide at 1,340 meters in the dark with 2 shots fired in 4 seconds and 12 men walking out of a compound intact. She was 18 months in a valley that no one knew she was in, building the intelligence that rebuilt the plan that brought them all home. She was SOT ICE earned at 25 years old in a program whose attrition rate was not published and whose graduates did not announce themselves. She was her father's daughter, trained on a Montana ridge before she was old enough to know she was being trained for something larger than a rifle range. She was her brother's promise kept in the only way that a promise like that can be kept up, not once, not dramatically, but every day in the discipline of the quiet moments and the precision of the ones that counted. She stood up. She picked up the case. She walked to the door of the gear room and threw it into the full light of the Afghan morning, where the base was already moving with the purposeful energy of people who had work to do and the capability to do it. Rodriguez was crossing the yard. Torres was running equipment checks with 2 other operators. Holt was drinking coffee near the operations building and looking at a map with the focused attention she had learned was his natural state. Brennan was visible through the window of the command building, standing at a table already working. She had walked through a door 12 days ago with a hard case and a classified order and no unit insignia, and a general had looked at her with the specific coldness of a man who had already decided what she was. And she had stood in that room and been exactly herself in the face of every assumption and every test and every moment of silence that was meant to make her smaller, and she had not moved an inch from who she was. And now she was here, and she was staying. Maya Chen set the case down, looked at the yard full of people who were now her team, and went to work.